What if South Vietnam won the Vietnam War? Well, before we get into that scenario, we have to look at why South Vietnam lost the war and see what we would need to change in order to create a South Vietnamese victory. Just a disclaimer, a South Vietnamese victory, in my view, is not South Vietnam taking over Hanoi, but just existing with its pre-war borders, as there was really no realistic chance at South Vietnam taking and holding North Vietnam, even though this is an alternate history video, that just is not even on the table. The South Vietnamese during the Vietnam War in our timeline had very poor morale, poor training, poor equipment, relied on the United States too much to defend their country, had a lot of internal issues such as massive corruption and lots of coups during the 1960s, which destabilized the country and its military effectiveness. Meanwhile, the NVA and Viet Cong had effective hearts and minds strategies despite committing mass atrocities on the South Vietnamese civilian population. The Viet Cong insurgency created an over-response on the part of the South Vietnamese government on their civilian population, and the NVA and VC received significant support from communist states such as the USSR and leased equipment from China. The US and SEATO support during the Vietnam War had their own problems. There was no treaty between South Vietnam and the US and SEATO for defense. The US gradually committed forces out of fear of triggering a Chinese intervention just like in the Korean War. The news reporting of the Tet Offensive broke the American public in 1968. U.S. grand strategy of search and destroy alienated the Vietnamese population, the Pentagon Papers leak further destroyed American morale, and the justification for the war with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was based on a lie by the Johnson administration. All of these conditions and more resulted in a communist takeover of South Vietnam. So, in order to create a South Vietnamese victory in the Vietnam War, there's a lot of things that we would need to change, as South Vietnam was in a pretty bad state during the war. Another disclaimer here is that there is going to be a lot of conditions to create a South Vietnamese victory, so be prepared for that. The first thing that we're going to address is to have South Vietnam have a defense pact with SEATO after the First Indochina War. This would help serve to deter North Vietnam from launching an invasion of South Vietnam, to have a treaty obligation for SEATO members to fight in Vietnam, and it could possibly boost ARVN morale, as there is more of a belief that South Vietnam is not going to fall to the North. Next, we're going to have to fix some of South Vietnam's internal horribleness if they're going to have any hope of winning the Vietnam War. In our timeline, there's a bunch of corruption and a buttload of coups from 1963 to 1965 alone. I don't think I need to explain why these coups and constant changes of leadership are bad for the country's military preparedness to fight a war and why it hindered U.S. support for South Vietnam. So in this timeline, that doesn't happen, or at least not as much as it did in ours. Without the level of corruption that had happened in our timeline, there aren't millions of dollars that go into the hands of South Vietnamese generals, and instead the money goes into training and equipping the ARVN to be properly able to fight a war. Another issue for U.S. support for the war that domestically happened that we can change is if the Gulf of Tonkin incident sees a second North Vietnamese attack occur instead of waves. This would be a necessary condition because without it, the reason for U.S. increased intervention and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is more justified than it was in our timeline. Another condition which would help South Vietnam's position but would definitely be stretching any attempts at realism would be to either have Barry Goldwater or Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. win the presidency in 1964 against Johnson. Lodge had been Kennedy's ambassador to South Vietnam during the early coups in South Vietnam and had been Nixon's running mate in 1960. Goldwater, meanwhile, had been the actual Republican nominee in 1964. Both men would heavily increase U.S. support for South Vietnam in the 1960s, assuming that the previous three conditions had been met. Another aspect that we can change is to make Operation Rolling Thunder a success. For those who don't know, Rolling Thunder was the U.S. bombing of North Vietnamese infrastructure and defensive systems from 1965 to 1968, and Johnson ran it very poorly. He demanded to have complete control over what gets bombed and when, instead of letting the military determine what should be hit. This resulted in the constant bombings of the same places in North Vietnam and the failure of the operation. In this alternate timeline, LBJ is sidelined and North Vietnam has more industrial areas destroyed, and this diverts their resources. Another condition that we can change in the Vietnam War is the Tet Offensive. Here we can either have no Tet Offensive take place by the Communists, which allows SEATO and the South Vietnamese to not have their morale destroyed by the NVA and Viet Cong deep penetration into the South. But that is about as realistic as a Republican victory in 1964 in the American presidential election. A more realistic change to the Tet Offensive that we can make would be to have SEATO forces be better prepared for the offensive, and MACV intelligence does not focus on the border regions instead of the populated cities in South Vietnam after the November 1967 Battle of Dak To. Furthermore, we could also have different U.S. media coverage of Tet to show a SEATO victory over a massive failed communist deception campaign and offensive into the South. The media in this timeline will also report on the VC and NVA atrocities and war crimes more often than they did in our timeline. Something else that we can change is if Billy Waugh and his SOG team was able to kill or capture NVA General Giap in June of 1967 during a SOG operation. Check out Chapter 13, titled Kill or Capture in the book Surprise Kill Vanish for further context on why Giap was so crucial to North Vietnam and why the operation had failed. Giap being out of the picture would seriously reduce communist effectiveness in Tet. Now we're going to go to some of the more extreme conditions that we can change to ensure a South Vietnamese victory in the war. Operation Fracture Jaw, which you might recall from Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War if you've played the game, which was where the US planned to bring nukes to Vietnam as an insurance policy for the war, but it was cancelled for serious reasons. In this timeline, Fracture Jaw is enacted, and when the North Vietnamese intelligence hears about it, they are more cautious when attacking cities in South Vietnam and launching pivotal offensives such as the Easter Offensive out of fear of being nuked. Another nuclear option that we can include in the South Vietnamese arsenal against the North is a tactical nuke that Billy Wah was going to deploy in North Vietnam and set off. In 1966, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara looked into using a tactical nuke on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Wah was part of a Greenlight operation team to drop it in on the Mu Gia Pass, a supply roadway that connected Vietnam and Laos. In 2017, Wah and Giap's son discussed this operation and agreed that North Vietnam would have lost the war had America deployed a tactical nuke in the Mu Gia Pass. Both of these actions, Operation Fracture Jaw and Wah's nuke, would be good for South Vietnam in the short term but bad in the long term, as it would likely lead to heavy criticism of the U.S. and U.S. foreign policy when it becomes leaked by the North Vietnamese after the war ends that the United States either had nukes in South Vietnam or, if it's open, that America nuked Vietnam in the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Also, there's no telling how the Soviets might want to deploy tactical nukes in places like Afghanistan after the end of the Vietnam War. Turning away from nuclear and extreme changes, we'll have Operations Linebacker 1 and 2 succeed in getting North Vietnam to come to the Paris Peace Accords, but in this timeline, the North Vietnamese will not conduct the Easter Offensive to gain more land to be in a better negotiating position. Next, we can also have Richard Nixon's covert bombings of Cambodia succeed in destroying the Ho Chi Minh Trail and be kept secret. Additionally, we'll change U.S. grand strategy from search and destroy to becoming clear and hold, like America did in Iraq during the surge to get the situation under control without slipping back into insurgent control. But in this case, it's not letting stuff slip back into Viet Cong control in South Vietnam. We'll also make the NVA and Viet Cong not receive support from China, as North Vietnam and China hated each other and would end up going to war after the Vietnam War ended with each other in our timeline. Something that can help ensure more of a South Vietnamese victory is if China and North Vietnam had border skirmishes during the Vietnam War. I know this isn't very realistic, but we'll assume that Chinese policymakers see some value in attacking North Vietnam while they're occupied fighting another war. And while China is moving away from the Soviet Union and towards the US, this would be something that they feel like is justified. The US, seeing this change in Chinese behavior, does not worry about escalating the war gradually to repeat the Korean War like they had in our timeline. In this alternate timeline, the US and SEATO fully commits to the war as intelligence shows that China and North Vietnam are fighting one another on the border. I know quite a few of these conditions to change are mostly unrealistic expectations and assumptions to make, but South Vietnam was in a really bad spot during the Vietnam War, and it's hard to make them realistically win against the NVA and Viet Cong, and these are just some of the conditions that I feel like would need to be met in order to create a South Vietnamese victory. Now that South Vietnam has won the Vietnam War and is allowed to exist with its pre-war borders, what are the effects? Well, since we have the South Vietnamese state exist and North Vietnam is seriously damaged, it's still unlikely that SEATO and South Vietnam invades the North, as nobody wanted to repeat the Korean War. Basically, North and South Vietnam are divided for a while and might reunify during the 1990s at the end of the Cold War, but it's possible that they could remain divided like the Koreas, except North Vietnam doesn't become as insane as North Korea did. It would be hard to predict how the two Vietnams would interact with each other throughout the rest of the Cold War, but I feel like both would support covert operations to undermine one another. The Soviets would definitely see the war in Vietnam as a failure to properly defeat a capitalist state using a proxy and would heavily intervene in the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1970s and 80s. Indochina would also see a communist support for groups in Cambodia in the Laotian Civil War, which causes border skirmishes in South Vietnam and Thailand. The US and SEATO tried to support Laos and Cambodia, but they would still fall as it took a lot to win the Vietnam War on the capitalist side. President Richard Nixon would likely not have the Watergate scandal, as his administration is in a better place from his first term, as America is winning the Vietnam War in the alternate timeline in 1972. Nixon would leave office after 2 full terms as a relatively popular president, but the question now comes, who succeeds him? The Democrats in this timeline wouldn't nominate Jimmy Carter, as America is in a better state and doesn't want a peanut farmer as president, and in this timeline the Democrats would likely nominate Mo Udell or Jerry Brown for their ticket in 1976. Without Watergate, the 1976 Republican primaries would likely have Reagan defeat Vice President Gerald Ford, as Ford is not the incumbent president. I'd say Reagan likely wins the 1976 election against whichever Democrat is nominated, but the 1980 election would be completely unknown as there are a lot that we have changed in the 1970s compared to our timeline. What do you think would have happened had South Vietnam won the Vietnam War? How do you think it could have happened and what would the effects be? Would you want a part 2 where I discuss if South Vietnam had invaded North Vietnam and that is how they actually win the Vietnam War? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.